Can you hear me? Really? I don't think it's coming through the PA system. They're hearing it on the computer. Okay. All right. All right. Well, good afternoon. My name is Chris Barkin, and I want to welcome all of you to the William W. Hay Railroad Engineering. Doesn't work. Um, Railroad Engineering Seminar here at the University of Illinois. So before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping items. Actually, before I do that, I'll say that evidently our PA system here is not working. So those of you sitting in the farthest corner of the room, if you can't hear, you might consider taking some of these seats down here. So as I said, before we introduce our speaker, I want to take care of some housekeeping items. First of all, if you have a cell phone, please put it on mute or turn it off so we don't have it going off during the presentation. If we have a fire alarm, please exit these doors at each corner of the A Center. And carefully, when you get to the ground floor, carefully cross Main Street. We'll gather next to Hydra Systems. Let's use the buddy system, so make note of who's next to you and make sure that they get out safely, please. We are not expecting severe weather, but if we were, or to have some unexpectedly, we'll exit this room, but instead of going outside, which is a bad idea, we'll continue down the hallway here to the west into the older part of Newmark Lab and go all the way down to the basement, which is a very safe refuge. If you haven't already signed the attendance sheet outside, we'll pass it around, and please do sign it because we need to have accurate numbers as to who attended to make sure that we can continue providing refreshments. And also on that same attendance sheet, if you did not receive a direct email announcement of this seminar but would like to in the future, please indicate your email address legibly on there and we'll add you to the list. We have a number of attendees online today and we want to welcome them. This is a partial list. Clark Construction, University of Wisconsin-Madison, Michigan Tech, Hanson Professional Services, Rail Sciences, Railstar, Metra, CSX, HDR, RK&K, Kansas City Southern Railway, URS, Parsons, I'm not going to get this right, University of British Columbia, Okanagan. If Tyler was here, he'd correct me. Winnebago County Highway Department, Illinois Department of Transportation, TTCI, and several other groups. Oh, University of Maryland. So again, welcome all of you who are joining us online. We're very pleased that you can participate. What I'd like to ask the speaker, for the benefit of the people who are joining us online, is if you get a question from the audience here, if you could repeat it as part of your answer, so to speak. Is Matt Green here? So you have an announcement? All right. The William W. Hay Railroad Seminar Series is sponsored by the National University Rail Center here at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And on behalf of all of us here at the university, we thank the U.S. Department of Transportation for their ongoing support. It's greatly appreciated by those of us here on campus, as well as those of you who are participating via the internet. Now, as those of you who are involved in transportation planning and engineering understand, there is extensive need to expand and improve transportation capacity for all modes. And as engineers, you could maybe say that we have the easy part. We know how to plan and design and build these things. The hard part is figuring out how to pay for it. And that's where our speaker today comes in. Particularly with the constrained fiscal environment in which many governments are functioning today, it means that traditional concepts for funding and financing of these projects must evolve. So our speaker today will discuss some of these new strategies, not only with regard to rail, but in the context of several other modes also. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker. Will I push a button. Well, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, my U of I colleague, New Rail Center co-principal investigator, and best of all, my friend, Mr. Steve Schlickman. Steve is Executive Director of the University of Illinois at Chicago Urban Transportation Center. He has over 35 years of transportation experience, beginning as a bus driver in 1975, with that on-the-ground experience with transportation, proceeding through his career to becoming the Executive Director of the Metropolitan Chicago Regional Transportation Authority in 2005. He left the RTA in October 2010 to take his current position at UIC's Urban Transportation Center. Steve oversees a program of research, education, and technical assistance on urban transportation planning, policy, operations, and management matters. In the course of his career, he's also worked for the CTA in Chicago, the City of Chicago, Washington office, and as a consultant to a number of organizations and companies. He completed his AB degree at Georgetown in 1975, majoring in government and minoring in theology, and he completed his JD degree at DePaul in 1979. During the course of his career in Illinois, he's been involved in all major surface transportation initiatives at the state and federal level since 1980. He has a lifelong passion for the subject of transportation and extensive experience on how to fund transportation projects. And in fact, he teaches a course on the subject at the University of Illinois. And that's what he's going to be discussing today. So please join me in welcoming our speaker today, Mr. Steve Schlickman, who will present the William K. Rarrett Engineering Seminar on an overview of the funding and finance of transportation projects.
Thank you, Chris. And Chris has assured me that while you are all very smart engineers, or to be engineers, you don't know much about financing. So this primer, which is really taken from my course, is an intention of introducing you to the topic and giving you some concepts that if you master, you should be pretty good at discussing this with those who are expert in the funding and finance of transportation. First, I want to go through this and give you a few fundamental concepts. And first, the funding versus finance distinction. We have two things we talk about a lot in the financing of transportation or funding. You talk about funding, which is really the term pay as you go, which means using existing revenue streams, grants, or tax revenues as they are received to pay for capital improvements. An example of that would be where IDOT takes a share of its gas tax revenue and spends it directly on a project. Financing, on the other hand, is equal or equivalent to debt and or equity. Debt financing advances the availability of a future revenue stream through borrowing. That means going into debt against those revenues. Example, the Illinois Tollway sells bonds, and they sell a lot of bonds, backed by their toll revenues for its capital program, and it has an enormous capital program that it's implementing right now. Equity financing, which isn't very common really in transportation, unless you're a railroad or airline. But this is through various investment products, investors actually will pay for an ownership interest in an infrastructure project or asset. One of the best examples right now, talking about innovation, is the private consortium arrangement for building the commuter rail line out to Denver International Airport. And in that arrangement, it's a design, build, operate, maintain, and finance arrangement. And in that, the owners of the consortium are actually putting $50 million of their own money into it. And it's a complicated scheme by which they get a return, but that is a type of equity investment. So, reasons why you would use PAYGO. One, you have level capital program requirements. You have no major projects. You don't have to borrow for the future. You have enough revenue to take care of existing needs. You have level revenue matching your capital needs. So, complements the first point. On the other hand, you may have significant projected future capital needs, and you don't want to borrow the money that's going to come then. You've got to preserve it for those big future needs. Or you have unstable revenue sources. If you have unstable revenue sources, the cost of your debt is going to be enormous. You probably have heard of junk bonds. That's probably what we're talking about in a situation like this. and it just wouldn't be economical. Or you have an existing debt burden. You just oversubscribed on debt. Advantages of debt financing include you can develop projects faster. You can address potential environmental, safety, and economic benefits sooner than you might otherwise. You can improve your short-term cash flow, so you don't have to take your current cash that might be important to operations, for instance. You can borrow from future cash flows. You match the project funding with the useful life of the asset. So if you buy a 30-year useful life rail car, you can issue 30-year bonds for that car. And people who are using that car in the future are actually paying for it. Spin-off benefits. Well, if you advance your capital program, it can help with your current operations, like increasing ridership. CTA just did a renewal of the Red Line South in 4 months. They shut it down, they replaced it, and actually hardly any loss of ridership, even though it was shut down for 4 months. And in fact, now it's running much better, and I would guess that it's going to generate new ridership for the CTA. Or it helps reduce maintenance expenses, because an asset beyond its useful life is more expensive to maintain. Some general financing considerations. You need to identify an approach that creditors will support. That is, they will actually buy your debt instrument or loan you the money. They are your market. Who's going to borrow from you? Key issue, is the arrangement cost effective? Now, if you really want to get into finance, you need to understand how to calculate net present value. I am not going to do that today. It's a long process, and it's rather technical. And in fact, I'm not really a master of the topic myself. But you want to have sense that this makes economic sense, and that will help you do it. You want a strategy overall that is selected that provides the best terms for meeting your cash flow needs and keeping your debt costs down. Financing risks have to be dealt with. More risks you have, the more it's going to be perceived as a risky investment by your borrowers, and more the cost of borrowing. So I mentioned earlier, reliability of a revenue stream. What if you have community and political opposition that will upset the whole plan for implementation? Litigation. What if you find you're going through a wetland and you're not maybe doing the proper mitigation that people in the area would want? You might get sued by the local Sierra Club. You have ramp-up difficulties. You can't get started when you said you were going to get started because maybe the complexity of the project. You have cost overruns. How are you going to pay for those cost overruns? You've got to explain that up front, and if they don't believe you, again, your borrowing will go up. System performance problems. The one I really like, I don't know if you remember when Denver International first opened, they had the state-of-the-art luggage system. It did not work. They had to keep the airport closed, and it took months to get the system up and running and to open it up. Now, that was a serious startup performance problem for that project. You hear about this idea of innovative finance and public-private partnerships. It's really a small percentage of the projects that we're talking about. And we're really just talking about, for the most part, projects that have a revenue base to them. You are not going to get the private sector very involved or interested in a project that does not have a revenue stream that they would like to take advantage of. So it's in this category at the top of the pyramid here where you find most of those type of strategies being implemented. You'll have them also in this area, but these are projects that while they may have some revenue-based approaches to them, they're suspect. They have difficulties, so that you need maybe some special credit enhancement, like the federal government might step in and help you with the borrowing through the TIFIA program, which I'll explain to you later. The vast majority of our projects are down here at the bottom of the pyramid. They're non-revenue transportation projects, and they're mostly done on a pay-go basis, but there is some debt. Because even on a pay-go basis, you can borrow against your future grants, which typically would be a pay-go when you received it. But if you're going to advance those future grant revenues through borrowing, that's a recent phenomenon over the last 10 years. The federal government did tweak the legislation to allow that to occur. Okay, structure and overview of the federal government. If you're doing any type of transportation project, you got to involve government. And I'm going to start with the federal government, a source of billions and billions of dollars for transportation. Many of you may not know, but our government, federal government, is structured with three branches. You have the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. If you want to chase money in Washington, you got to understand how this works. I've been chasing money there for about 35 years. The executive branch is the administrator of the federal government. But the executive branch can't do a whole lot without being told by the legislature what it can do, or what is the executive branch authorized to do. So really, between the two, you really have to start with the legislative side and then populate a structure over here for the executive side through legislation. And in the legislative branch, you have a House and a Senate. It's bicameral, we call it. Most states in this country have a similar structure, except one. Does anybody know which one that is? Only one House? Nebraska. Once they pass the laws that structure the executive branch, then the president has something to manage below him, the executive offices, the departments, and the agencies. I'm not going to talk much about the judicial branch, but as you know, there's always people who want to sue you no matter what you're doing. So even in transportation project finance, you'll find yourself in court someday. But I'm not going to go into that side. So let's talk about the executive branch and how it was structured by Congress to serve transportation. Quickly, you got the president at the top. You have the Office of Management and Budget. That's the gatekeeper for funding. In as much as the president controls his funding. And you have the U.S. Department of Transportation. Now, there's many other departments, as we know. There's Department of Defense, Department of Commerce, there's the State Department. The U.S. Department of Transportation was created back in the early 60s, and a number of modal agencies were put underneath it. You have the Federal Transit Administration, Federal Highway Administration, Federal Railroad Administration, Highway Safety Administration. I forget all what those letters mean. Federal Aviation Administration. Amtrak has a dotted line relationship with FRA, and then a number of other lesser organizations. Since 9/11, they took the Coast Guard from down here and put it up under a new Homeland Security branch of reporting directly to the president. It used to be part of DOT, and also we have the TSA. One thing, if you walk out of here not remembering anything about the legislative branch, is one thing I want you to carry, at least one thing, and that is Congress is ruled by committees. When you approach Congress, you have to know how the committees work. And there are a slew of committees in Congress, and they're all on this slide, that affect transportation. And it's a mixture of what I call authorizing committees, or generally called authorizing committees, appropriation committees, and revenue committees. In the House, we only have one authorizing committee for transportation. That's the T&I committee, Transportation and Infrastructure. Then you have the appropriations or the revenue committee. Appropriations committee, and then you have the revenue committees, Ways and Means, and over in the Senate's Finance. The difference between the Senate and the House is on authorization. The Senate has three committees for authorization, and that's actually a reason why our federal government is somewhat disjointed rather than integrated modally. It's because of the Senate and how the jurisdictions evolved over time. There's a whole lot of cooperation between these committees, except on the big authorization bill that I'll talk about in a minute. But even then, it could be better integrated. But we're talking about power politics here, and it keeps them separate. I kind of glossed over the fact that there are budget committees. I don't talk about them too much because that's been a failure of our system for a long time. So this is basically the environment in which you're operating when you approach the federal government. It's called the Iron Triangle, sometimes the Golden Triangle, because we're talking about money. But on each point here, you have the administration on one side, public interest groups on the other, and at the top, you have congressional committees. If you're approaching a major issue in Congress, particularly one of national scope, and you're on the public interest side, you want partnerships to go in all directions here for your issue. If you can create effective partnerships between all three parties here, you're likely going to win. Types of funding legislation. Like I said, there's authorizing committees, and the authorization legislation creates the funding program structure and the ceiling of the funding that can be appropriated. The appropriation committee handles appropriations, and what they do is annually set the funding amount within the authorized ceiling. Now, the budget committee, if that worked, and it hasn't very well, the budget committees would come in and actually set ceilings on the appropriators and the authorizers themselves in order to try and, because these are multi-year authorizations. In any given year, there's a new set of economic situation facing, like the recession, facing federal government. So the budget committee can come in and adjust the ceilings that are created by the authorizing committees in order to lower or raise, hopefully, the funding levels that are actually sending money out from the federal government. We already talked about authorizing and appropriating committees. Grants. These grants are authorized by the authorizing committee and then funded through the appropriation legislation. The money then goes, once it's all enacted, signed by the president, the money goes to federal transportation agencies for either their allocation or their apportionment to local recipients. Now remember those two terms, allocation and apportionment, that's important. When the grant is awarded, usually it requires a local match in order for the local recipient to receive it. On the Highway and Transit Program, the match is about 20% of the project cost. Airports, it's either 5% or 25%. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Discretionary grant funding is funding that Congress grants a federal agency, USDOT in our case, the discretion to allocate. When you have discretionary money, federal government allocates those funds based on a prescribed set of criteria. They're typically done through a competitive grant process, and the state, localities, and others who are eligible have to submit a grant application that competes against other grant applications to win the grant. Formula money, on the other hand, and I tried to put the most convoluted formula I could squeeze in there. Formula funding, on the other hand, are grants that are apportioned to recipients with no federal agency discretion. They're distributed through the formula that's created by Congress, and we in the industry like this because it's more, you can predict what your future funding will be. The problem with formula funding, it doesn't allow you to deal with lumpy demand. So if, it's going to be a pretty consistent level of funding over the life of the bill, but if you suddenly have a major bus garage you have to replace, or a rail yard or something like that, your formula funding may not be able to fund that. Or a bridge falls down, yes. Factors that go into these formulas include population, service levels, vehicle lanes or vehicle miles, airport landings and takeoffs. Operating versus capital costs. Operating costs, these are costs associated with operating and the maintenance of the system. It includes elements such as your labor, short life maintenance items, and the administration of operations. Capital is all tangible property which cannot easily be converted into cash, and which is usually held for a long period and includes things such as real estate, vehicles, major equipment, and your facilities. So, those are the concepts that you should know if you want to be conversant in the following modal funding programs. The Federal Aid Highway Program is an umbrella program of many sub-programs, so I'll be using the word interchangeably, but between the big overall program and the sub-programs. And it refers to the activities of the Federal Highway Administration. This program was created in the 1950s. It was catalyzed by the establishment of 1956 of the Highway Trust Fund. It was promoted by Republican President Eisenhower, And since then, many Republican presidents have supported gas tax increases. Just thought you should know that. 90% of the revenue for the Highway Trust Fund comes from the motor fuel taxes. 18.4 cents on a gallon of gas, which hasn't been raised since 1993. If it had kept up with inflation, it would be at least 31 cents today. And for diesel, it's 24.4 cents per gallon. Other taxes include gasohol, special fuels, truck and trailer sales, tire tax, truck safety violation, truck weight, what have you. And money goes into two accounts in the trust fund, the highway account and the mass transit account. Now, what's going on with the highway trust fund? It's almost broke. It will be insolvent, and this is this week's report from one of the committees in Congress, that it may go bust in July or early August on the highway side, and soon thereafter on the transit side. And without new revenues, projects for 2015, and maybe some projects this year, will not be funded. They need to deal, keep trying to hit the button. Okay. They need to deal with this future collapse of the whole program. And they are. I mean, they want to. They just don't know how to do it because it means raising taxes. User fees, yeah. That's what Republicans call them, user fees. Recent history of surface transportation authorization bills. These bills are primarily, I put the wrong word in there, for highway and transit programs. We had the landmark ICE-T legislation in 1991. When that expired, it took 1 year to do the next bill. T21, 6-year bill. When that expired, it took 2 years to extend it. Safety New, 5-year bill, took 3 years to extend it. Then MAP 21 was passed. That expires at the end of this year. How long is that going to take to get done? Now, with those extensions, they kept the money rolling, but it was, intermittent. They have a short-term resolution of 6 months. Then that would expire. They have to do another one, and now it's a whole lot of uncertainty in the system, and it's hard to financially plan against that type of approach. Yes. I'll get to that in just a minute. So, MAP 21 is a 2-year authorization enacted in 2012. Expires September 30th. It really didn't raise funding, and in fact, it only maintained funding that was at the end of the previous bill, and there was no attempt to address the Highway Trust Fund insolvency. In fact, what they did is that they borrowed money from the federal government. They increased the deficit, in other words, in order to keep the Highway Trust Fund solvent through these two years. What it did was a lot of program restructuring and streamlining, and most discretionary programs were eliminated. Everyone was not very happy with this, but at least it kept the program going. To your question, no, they would like to reauthorize this, but you need to deal with the trust fund. And if they can't deal with the trust fund, my guess is it's just going to be another set of extensions until they can get there politically. Under MAP 21, each state received its equal share of its FY12 apportionment under the previous authorization. And now they have this minimum guarantee of 95%, which means that if you only put in 95 cents on the dollar from your contribution as a state, 90%, they'll make adjustments to everyone so you can get up to 95% return on your tax dollar to the federal government. Illinois is getting about $1.37 billion per year, or $0.39 billion per year. We moved up to the second highest funded state in the country. We get about 99% rate of return on our fuel taxes, so we don't have to worry about the 95% minimum. And we're about almost 4% of the national total. I'm not going to go through this, but this is how the program was condensed from the programs on the left to the programs on the right. So the major programs now are the National Highway Performance Program, the Surface Transportation Program, Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality, Highway Safety Improvement, and Transportation Alternatives. Federal transit programs. Mass Transit Account or the Highway Trust Fund is the primary source of funding for transit, but there's about a 20% of the program comes from general revenues. This Mass Transit Account was created in 1992 as part of the bargain for a fuel tax increase. So President Reagan, Republican, wanted an increased gas tax for highways. Congress, primarily Democrats, driven by urban interests, said, we're not going to increase it unless you put some money in for transit. So that was the first year transit actually got a share of the highway user fees, 1 cent, produces about $1 billion back then, went dedicated to its program. After that, the tradition has been to give transit 20% of any fuel tax increase. So the transit account now has about 2.86 cents per gallon going into its account. The program is comprised of a number of major programs. Organized Area Formula Program is the most important program. It gives funding to all public transit systems in the country. It can fund capital and operating assistance, and was for urbanized areas with population of more than 50,000. It's about $4.4 billion a year. Now, areas with population of over 200,000 actually cannot use these funds for operating. But there is this exception for preventive maintenance, which is really normally an operating expense, but they capitalize it in the federal program. And that there's also an exception for certain systems with small bus fleets, but big population. Rural area formula grants. We have a lot of transit in the rural areas, believe it or not. It's not just an urban program, and there's a special program for them, which is listed here. This is a new program, State of Good Repair. The U.S. Department of Transportation under the Obama administration is very concerned about state of good repair for the entire transportation system, but in particular for the public transit systems under the Federal Transit Administration. So there's a program actually called the State of Good Repair Program. It's $2.1 billion. It's primarily for rail projects. However, some bus systems can get into it if they are operating in HOV or HOT lanes, high occupancy vehicle, high occupancy toll lanes, which kind of operate like a rail system. So this program is primarily for cities with older transit networks, which are the primary beneficiaries. Now, what took a hit when they increased funding for rail without an overall increase in the overall program, they had to take it from somewhere, so they took it out of the bus and bus facilities program, which was not many of us, I'm a big advocate for rail. This was not a good idea, and now we have cut that program in half practically, and it's impacting the small transit systems who are finding it difficult to bring together enough grants for their large bus systems. There's one program I'm going to talk about later. It's under transit. It's the New Start program. Federal aviation programs. Airports, they're probably, next to freight rail, they're probably the closest thing to be self-financing. Airports are funded through a series of fees and charges on those who use the airport, be it the, I keep missing the button, the airlines or private concession companies that are providing, the food and what have you at the airport, rental car facilities. And through these revenues that come in, the airports will issue what are called general airport revenue bonds for the whole airport, or special facility revenue bonds where the revenue is dedicated to a particular facility. Another asset that was given to airports back in 1990, which I was very much involved in getting for City of Chicago, are the passenger facility charges, and then there's the grants that are supplied by the federal government. The Airport Airway Trust Fund is what supplies those or funds those grants. It was created in 1970. It's based on taxes related to what's listed here: passenger tickets, passenger flight segments, intermodal arrivals and departures, cargo way bills, aviation fuels, and frequent flyer miles or awards. And it produces about an overall program of about $15 billion per year. Now, the biggest program in there is the Airport Improvement Program. Virtually every significant airport in the country can tap into this. It's a formula program. And there's a very small program that's discretionary that can be allocated by US DOT. It funds the planning and also the implementation of those plans through the development projects. But it's only on the air side. It's on the side that's beyond TSA. That's the air side. It does not fund what's in before the TSA, if you want to call it that. It goes for primarily capacity projects, but also security, environmental mitigation, and it can be used to retire bonds. Commercial revenue producing areas of the airport, in other words, those concessions on the other side of TSA, cannot benefit from these grants. Federal share is 75% for large and medium primary hub airports and 95% for small relievers and general aviation airports. Passenger facility charge. This was the biggest boon to airports in a long time. Federal government authorizes airports to collect up to $4.50 every time you board a plane at that airport. And it's only for commercial airports controlled by public agencies. It's an important complement to AIP funding, and it can be used on the air side and the ground side. So it can actually fund, like in New York, a transit line that goes exclusively into Kennedy Airport. But if you levy a PFC, you take a hit on your AIP allocation. So now, dang it. The other apportionment from the AIP is now 20% of it, 25% of its original. The AIP program is actually becoming a non-factor for airports, who are becoming more and more reliant on the PFC. Essential Air Service is for small communities who have airports that would not otherwise attract the airline unless they were able to give the airline subsidies. They get that funding through the Essential Air Service program. We have 3 in Illinois: Decatur, Marion, Heron, and Quincy. This is very controversial. There's a lot of congressmen who feel that this is a waste of money, and it has been an issue in authorization legislation in particular. The FAA last authorization was in 2012, provided $63 billion over 4 fiscal years. No increase in jet fuel taxes, which was on the table. Essential Air Service to remote airports continued, but the funding is gradually being reduced. No new communities are eligible. That was a key agreement. Yes?
Yeah, regarding so we use Decatur as an example. Given it, idea how much money per year they get?
It's a pretty small amount. It's probably a couple million. Yeah, yeah. Well, there are, I can look this up for you, but there are requirements that you have to have a minimum number of passengers each year in order to be eligible.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm getting at is, of course, in the lowest tier, how many tens or 20 or hundreds of dollars per Amtrak passenger
Right. Right, and I forgot to repeat your question, by the way. So we're talking about Essential Air Service and what type of usage is there actually that supports this funding, and that's part of the controversy too. In some of these airports, the use is so low it's almost laughable. So I'm going to move into Amtrak passenger rail. By the way, I did not put any high-speed rail slides in here. I ran out of time in updating this deck. But I'd be glad to answer any questions about that later. So Amtrak, who went without an authorization for many, many years, finally got the Passenger Rail Investment and Improvement Act, otherwise known as PRIA, in I think it was FY08 for the years 9 through 13. It expired last year, and the authorized amounts were never fully funded. Appropriators capped that funding. In FY14, we're back to the usual from before PRIA. It's now just authorized in an appropriations bill. An appropriation can serve as an authorization if there's no objection from the authorizers. And in this case, there's enough support for Amtrak to allow that to happen. It's funded completely by general revenues, doesn't produce any fees that it is used to fund it. And therefore, a lot of people who want to criticize Amtrak say that it's a suck on our deficit. And that's a problem. The general revenue support is a problem for many legislators. So Amtrak advocates would very much like to get a slice of dedicated revenue, be it a higher user fee or something else. This shows you Amtrak funding over the period of PREA and in 2014. You can see it's pretty flat, and it's actually been going down. And you know what? This isn't really dramatic from 15 years ago. So Amtrak has really been squeezed in terms of its federal support for many, many years. It's just part of the controversy of how many people view Amtrak as not being of national interest, which is unfortunate. So now I reserve some programs to talk about in this category. These are the major federal discretionary programs. I told you how federal government's moving away from it and pretty much has, except for these. Now, discretionary programs is where all the earmarking has occurred in the past that you've heard about. And by the way, does anybody know when the first congressional earmark was passed? Was it 20th century, 19th century, 18th century? 18th century. First appropriation bill was an earmark for a lighthouse in Massachusetts. So Congress has been earmarking from day one. But it became so controversial because of the Bridge to Nowhere in Alaska and the 5,000 or more earmarks that were in the last authorization bill, some of which gave money from the highway program to transit projects, which even though transit projects weren't supposed to be eligible for that money. In fact, 20% at that time, before MAP 21, the federal highway program had 20% of its grants were discretionary and mostly earmarked by Congress. In other words, Congress actually took the discretion back by earmarking it and did not allow the federal US DOT to exercise its own discretion. 30% of the transit program was discretionary, and most of those monies were earmarked as well through the New Starts and Bus Facilities program. Bus Facilities, I forgot to mention, is now completely a formula program. Before it was discretionary. Aviation, there has been some earmarking in there too, not quite as much as we used to have in transit and highway, but it was somewhat significant. Now, since 2011, there's a rule in the House that says if there's earmarking, the bill will not pass. So because of that House rule, all earmarks, and these are special targeted pieces of legislation. I think I have it defined here. Maybe I had it earlier, but a special piece of legislation that actually says the specific project and the location of that project for it to receive funding. Now, formulas are becoming the most important factor, and again, that's not a bad thing. I mean, it gives you a lot of certainty. Politically, it hamstrings people in Congress who needed or liked earmarks in order to make their case for being reelected. Now, the biggest transportation discretionary program is the Federal Transit Administration's New Starch program. This is what's funding all your new rail systems around the country, for the most part. It funds, we have a definition of fixed guideway, which actually includes now bus rapid transit and all the other modes of rail, light rail, heavy rail, trolleys, and it also includes water ferries. Those are considered a dedicated fixed guideway, interestingly. See, if you pass a law, you can make anything, really. It used to be funded under $2 billion, now, and it was 100% earmarked by the appropriators. Now it's up to, where's the number? $1.9 billion, almost $2 billion for FY13 and 14. They've added to it in MAP 21 this concept of core capacity. This is like, if you know the Chicago Transit Authority, the Brown Line was funded under the New Start program through a special piece of legislation, and it was sort of like an earmark. It was an earmark in the previous authorization. Well, it really wasn't a new system. It wasn't an extension of a system, but it increased the capacity of the Brown Line by expanding the 6-car stations to 8-car stations. And actually had very good performance numbers compared to other new starts around the country. Core capacity projects are now eligible on this program for everyone. This program was funded in the past, and they did put it in for a funding in authorized funding for FY13 only, and it was going to fund these projects of national and regional significance. One of them, which I think is the CREATE program. I think the CREATE got a big slug of money. I think you all know what CREATE is. We'll talk about it again a little later. Got a big slug of money from this program in the past. However, the appropriators didn't like it because it was discretionary. So they didn't want to give USDOT the discretion to allocate it, so it wasn't appropriated. And there's a definition of what these projects are. They're critical projects of national significance. Now, one thing that has become very popular, and the administration has used all of its leverage to continue, and that's the TIGER program, Transportation Investments Generating Economic Recovery. It started with the stimulus legislation in 2009, and you can see that it had a number of iterations, rounds 1 through 4, and Illinois did very well, not surprisingly, under this program. In the TIGER 5, it only received 1 grant for some rail improvements in Springfield, I assume associated with the 110 service. Oh, yeah. Our IDOT official. The what? Oh, okay. It's the movement of the line from one street to another street, right? Oh, grade separate. I'm sorry. Part of the same thing? Okay. Now we have TIGER 6 that was it was part of the big budget deal that they had at the end of last year that stopped sequestration, and the administration got TIGER 6, and it's been announced, and you can apply for this right now, so go check the website. I think you heard about budget sequestration. This was something that was supposed to induce Congress to come up with a budget deal and deal with the deficit, and lo and behold, they couldn't. And so sequestration actually took effect, I think it was in 2012 or 13, and cut programs across the board throughout the federal government. This law, actually, sequestration is supposed to continue until 2021, and if it cut $140 billion annually, it would be devastating, particularly to both the Department of Defense and our discretionary programs, domestic programs, not discretionary, domestic programs. Highway and airport trust funds are exempt from sequestration, and when it did occur, it actually did cut about $2 billion in transportation-related cuts, not related to the trust funds. Now, with that big budget deal, we've got a reprieve for 2014 and 2015. They've actually had a bump in funding to cover past sequestration cuts, and it's helped federal government because before they were in a freeze, now they're more in a hiring mode. And so if you're looking for a federal job, now's the time to get one. Regional, state, local transportation funding and finance, real quick. As I said, states are kind of structured similar to the federal process. So we have the Illinois Department of Transportation, which was created by state legislation and is under the purview of the governor, equivalent of the president at the federal level. And the highway money comes through DOT and is distributed. It keeps a lot of it for itself, and then distributes that which it has to distribute to local governments, including the Metropolitan Planning Organization, which is a required agency. Every urbanized area must have an MPO that looks at all surface transportation funding in an integrated viewpoint. And money cannot actually go straight, not just the MPOs, but also local governments. Transit money, by the way, goes straight to the transit authorities, but their projects have to be in the MPO process or in their MPO budget. IDOT's budget is approved by the Illinois House and Senate and was signed by the governor. This is kind of the structure of hierarchy. Don't consider this chart a flow of funds. It's more or less a flow of influence. And at the top here, we have the 800-pound lovely gorilla for those who are at IDOT. IDOT. And they chair the policy committee, which of the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. Policy committee is the designated MPO. The Illinois State Toll Highway Authority does not receive federal funding, so it's not really affected by this process, but participates in it. Then all of these other agencies below the MPO, below CMAP, are also on the policy committee and can influence, if they need to, how that money is allocated. The way it actually works, it's not a top-down process, it's more of a bottom-up process. These planners, these transportation agencies, including the municipalities, counties, and city government, all of which spend transportation money, they create their program of projects. They pretty much know what the funding availability is, and RTA coordinates with the service boards, creates a regional budget, and then they send it to CMAP or to the policy committee through CMAP. In the past, CMAP just pretty much accepted it. Today, CMAP is developing performance measures as it's mandated to do under MAP 21, and it intends to use those performance measures to make funding decisions. One thing it did, it only allowed one transit expansion project into what's called a constrained budget, MPO budget, and that did not sit well with a lot of people in the region. There's only a few other major expansion projects in there that they deem as affordable over between now and 2040. Here's the state highway program budget. I think I got this from IDOT. As you can see, they heavily, again, I hit the wrong button. They heavily rely on the federal government. It's 57% of the total program. They had the Illinois Jobs Now and Jumpstart back in, I think, '09, was it? And that has significantly increased funding. In fact, I think IDOT has one of the biggest programs it's ever had, highway programs it's ever had. Some of it goes to local areas as well. Municipalities, and I'm not sure if counties get any of this money. I'm not really an expert on highway funding. Here's what it's spent on. And if you notice system expansion, it's only 10% of the overall budget. So most of this is going for state of good repair, maintaining what we've got. And actually, it's a challenge. Okay, I think I'm going to talk about that challenge a little later in my slides. State transit. Illinois is divided between northeastern Illinois and downstate in terms of transportation policy. In fact, I forgot to mention earlier, 55% of the highway funds in the state goes to which area? Downstate. 45% goes to Chicago. From the CMAP point of view, that's a problem. If you were to do this on the basis of performance measures, it would be the reverse. And it might even be more money, highway money going than 55% to Northeastern Illinois. But on the transit side, Northeastern Illinois receives actually 90% of the state transit funds. So there's a balancing effect here. IDOT does work closely with RTA on Northeastern Illinois planning and funding. IDOT also works with Rural Transit Assistance Center at Western Illinois and the Illinois Public Transit Association working on their programs. The RTA, I call this the four-headed monster. I'm way out there and criticizing the structure and that we should have one agency, and I'm not making friends with the service boards. But it is an authority that was created in '74. It reformed in '83. The RTA is not an operator. It's an oversight agency. It's a taxing authority. It has a number of planning functions and auditing functions and budgeting functions that's supposed to help keep the whole system well coordinated and financed. The governor's task force on RTA is going to issue a report on all this on April 3rd. Look for that. They've already announced that they would like to get rid of the RTA and either turn this over to IDOT or condense it into one agency like the New York system in New York City. There was this reform of the RTA in 08 that I was involved in. Felt pretty good about that because with the increase in the sales tax, the real estate transfer tax at the City of Chicago, and the additional state match, we asked for $400 million, and we came back with $500 million, and then the recession took 20% of that away. So still, we're pretty much close to what we wanted originally. And we did it by agreeing to a number of reforms, which I don't have time to go into. I'm not going to go into all of this, but you'll have this as something you can refer to. Here, this is the income and spending of the RTA. Illinois Freight. There is a rail freight assistance program in Illinois. It's a capital assistance to communities, railroads, and shippers to preserve and improve service. I don't think it's very large. It's only $5 million between FY13 and 17, and it includes some federal funds. The important program here is the Chicago Region Environmental and Transportation Efficiency Program, CREATE, which is dealing with the bottleneck in Chicago. $1 billion has been spent today. There's $2.6 billion more to spend if we can get the money. Illinois Amtrak Service. In 2008, PREA required all short-distance services to become state-supported routes. States must pay the proportional cost of those routes. Illinois had already been doing that, but because of PREA is doing more, there are now 8 state-supported trains that were added over 13 years. In the IDOT subsidy, Amtrak has grown from $9 million in 2000 to 37 million in 2014. State funding for aviation. There is a small program, $120 million in the Illinois Jobs Now, which was the last state bill. It's going to run out next year, I believe. And it only goes to small airports. It's not go to the large airports in Chicago. $100 million for the new South Suburban Airport. How are we doing on time? We're supposed to wrap it up at 1:30? Oh. Okay. Okay, good. Again, I'm not going to go through this. I would have taken this slide out. I think I was looking at it this morning on the train. I thought this was way too much detail for this presentation, but it's in here for information purposes. Here, this shows how transit is really constrained to fund its needs. It has a growing backlog. RTA recently estimated that it needs over $30 billion to bring its system up to a state of good repair, and it projects to only have about $11 billion over like a 10-year period to do that, so it's got a $20 billion shortfall. That's a serious problem. This is how money has been divided among CTA, Metro, and PACE. This is a special bond proposal that former executive director of the RTA proposed that was rejected by the service board, so I'm not going to go into that too much. The current state bond program has been very important to many things. Let's see, it's $2 billion Series A bonds were part of a stimulus effort called Jumpstart, and it mainly was road resurfacing, but a lot for the rebuilding of Wacker Drive. If you know Wacker Drive, that's a very important artery in the city of Chicago. But there was a lack of reliable funding for it, so it really didn't measure up to what it had hoped to. The important part of the capital program is the Illinois Jobs Now, $31 billion capital program, $14 billion dedicated to transportation, $1.5 billion for northeastern Illinois, and you see the benefits of that. Trouble ahead. Last fiscal year, Illinois spent $1 billion less on road projects. The backlog is now growing. Only 68% of the system is deemed acceptable condition. Why? A drop-off of federal funding or the lack of purchasing value in that funding, that program, because it hasn't been keeping up with inflation. Declining revenues from state collected taxes, and people shifting their habits. More fuel-efficient cars are reducing the amount of revenue going into the road fund here and the trust fund at the federal level. And this shows how the backlog is going to start mounting for highways if we don't have another major capital program. Innovative finance. What is innovative financing? It's unique financing strategies that overcome perceived project and program risk. What you do is you get special credit or cash flow support from somewhere. It's kind of a mouthful. Moves the traditional transportation funding process away from a single strategy of aid through pay-go grants. It's a more diversified approach to utilizing the capital markets and the private sector at the same time. Reasons to use innovative finance can be used on projects that are too difficult to finance because of their scale and complexity. Be something like, actually the CTA, it's an innovative financing method. It's design build. They're design building with one contractor as opposed to a designer and a builder, about 7 stations on the red line, which is an operating line. It more effectively uses existing financial resources to serve the system. It moves projects into construction more quickly because you can get over the risk issues. It increases public and private investment in transportation infrastructure, mostly in revenue-based projects, as I mentioned earlier. It supplements, it does not replace traditional financing mechanisms. Grant management. I mentioned that you can now borrow against future grants. This was first done on the highway program, which what was called Garvey bonds. It's now done on the transit program as well. I'm not sure about the aviation program. And in the highway and transit legislation, you can actually move money from the highway side to the transit side and vice versa if you have the proper authority either from the federal government, or not federal government, the state government, which would be the governor, or the MPO. Flexible match. Sometimes you can use federal money to match federal money. Now, this is the most important innovative financing feature at the federal level. It's the Transportation Infrastructure and Finance Innovation Act. Was established in 1998. It provides credit assistance in the form of lines of credit, which is short-term startup money, a loan guarantee to back your ability to borrow from the markets. The federal government will tell the markets, don't worry about this being a junk bond agency. I'm going to back them up, and now they'll become a AAA agency because I'm backing them up. It's a little exaggeration, but or they might provide direct loans to a project themselves. But they still want, actually, that was an exaggeration, they will not back a junk bond type agency. They really want you to be a pretty good risk, but what they'll do is really on the margin, where projects are just can't get over the hump to be economically viable in a bond scheme. Federal government will come in and help you get over that point. Today, $11 billion in funding used to leverage over $44 billion in capital. MAP 21 expanded this greatly. In fact, tolling up there. All right, tolling. New capacity for tolling. Tolling only on new capacity lanes. Federal government will not allow you to put tolls on existing highways or, and most importantly, interstates. But if you add a lane, you can toll that lane. They won't give you federal funding for it. You have to do it out of the tolls. TIFIA, big increase. It's going to be worth over $17 billion in support through this seed money of $1.75 billion. It's going to fund the new Riverwalk in Chicago. It's funding the extension of the People Mover at O'Hare. It's through a competitive grant process, and you have to. What's important is they really will not accept projects that aren't very credit worthy. So you really have to try to boost your credit worthiness in your application as much as you can in order to get these funds. Design build. I mentioned that earlier. The traditional way, and still a very common way of building a project, is you design it and then you build it. Or you might plan one company, design one company, build one company, or a consortium of companies. Design build brings all that together into a single point of responsibility. One entity performs everything. Advantages: saves time and money. It creates a clear source of responsibility for project delivery. The risks are shifted to the contractor. That's a good thing from a sponsor's point of view. Disadvantages: you're giving up a lot of control to that contractor. It's risky when it's done for complex projects, particularly if you're not quite sure what you really want. you're not going to get what you really want. You're going to get what the contractor thinks you really want, which might be two different things. And the contractors will build in higher costs to deal with risk. So you've got to, you don't do design build unless you're smart about design build. If you're not smart about design build, you hire a company who is smart and then they manage it for you. Variations of design build, bridging, turnkey, design build warranty, design build maintain, design build operate maintain, and what I don't have on here is also finance. Thank you.
Got time for some questions?
Well, I have a question for you. Can I pose my question?
Yeah.
How would we deal with the insolvency of the Highway Trust Fund? What should we do there? The President has proposed using the corporate tax reform to fund it through corporations. The Ways and Means Committee chair has done the same thing. Doesn't seem to be getting much support. Should we stick with a gas tax? People hate the gas tax. Should we put sales tax on the gas tax? They hate sales tax on the gas tax. Should we move the tax to where they can't see it on the refineries? What do you think? Yes? Wait, you want to get the mic?
I've thought, well, I don't know if this
It
works.
works for the internet.
Okay. I thought that a vehicle miles traveled type of fine or fee would work well because it does effectively the same thing that the gas tax used to be, but then it doesn't take into consideration the fuel efficiency of the vehicle.
Right.
And so you could build that on when you're doing licensing for vehicles annually. And so that's one thought that I've had.
You're right. It deals with some of the problems of the gas tax because of fuel efficient or electric vehicles. But vehicle miles traveled are not growing as much as they used to. So in fact, in many cases, they're flat or have gone down. So based on that criteria, it wouldn't necessarily generate what you would hope to get out of it. On the other hand, another issue is implementation. We have a couple states, I know Washington and Oregon, and I think Maryland, are looking at this and experimenting with it. But how do you deal with out-of-state cars? And someone suggested maybe the NSA should take over, and that they could do it. We won't even know it. So there's privacy issues involved with it, and so it's really not there. It's not ready for prime time. It's not a solution to our short-term problem.
What about tolling?
Yeah, there's a big push to toll. Of course, the Association of Toll Roads, I forget their name, International Bridge and Tunnel Toll, whatever. They are very big on allowing more tolls, of course. And on the other hand, the user groups, truckers in particular, are against it. So is there enough to switch the federal policy on that? I would say probably not.
Yeah, I mean, there are the political issues which, taxes are bad, even though, in my opinion, a gas tax is really just another name for a user fee. If you're not using gasoline, you're not paying the tax, right?
Right.
And similarly with tolling, I mean, if you're not using the portion of the road that has tolls, then you're not having to pay for it. I mean, to me, these seem like equitable means of administering for sharing the cost amongst the people who are actually making use of it, unless we have a different philosophy about it, and that's a legitimate policy question.
The problem is they've let this go so long. They haven't raised the motor fuel tax since 1993, that in order to stabilize the trust fund and to actually grow the program, both highways and mass transit, you need about a doubling of the current gas tax. And it's in the past, it's been hard enough just doing a 5-cent increase.
Has there been a consideration of converting the flat per gallon tax to like a percentage?
Yes.
To where it'd be like
That's,
at least equal for now, but then at least with inflation it would, then in the future it would be more?
Yes, that has been proposed, and it most recently proposed by the Transportation for America group, which is a pretty good coalition of an eclectic group of people. And they have put out a menu of those type of schemes, all of which are focused on the fuel side, as opposed to the vehicle miles traveled. They're not proposing that. That's, I think, what you have to do. You can't tell Congress, oh, you can only really increase the gas tax. No, I think you got to give them a menu of options. They have to ultimately deal with the insolvency. They have to make the choices how to deal with it. If they want to keep borrowing and increasing the deficit and throwing money from general revenues into the trust fund, fine. But it's probably going to mean that the program's not going to grow, and it's just purchasing value is just going to go down. Yes, sir.
What is the philosophical or political argument? Even the simple notion of increasing the gasoline tax. What's the underlying philosophy that's opposing that actually has any credibility?
It doesn't poll well.
I'm sorry.
All
right. So
people don't trust that their money's going to be returned to something that they will benefit from.
Yeah, but the alternative, as you say, is the money comes out of the general fund, which is even worse, in my opinion.
But it gets complicated explaining that to the person on the street. It just doesn't understand the federal process. They hate the federal government right now, particularly Congress. They're at 20% approval rating, or even lower. At least Obama is still somewhere in the 40s. Any more?
How do we respond to the point that you sometimes hear people opposing? You described the process. I actually didn't know, and it was interesting to hear how it seemed to be that a fraction of the gas tax or the highway trust fund goes to transit projects, and that was a classic result in compromise. But how do you answer, besides that sort of political compromise, that that's the right thing to do? How do you defend that?
Putting money in the mass transit? Yeah.
Because the argument of the motor vehicle users, they say,
well, I would say,
paying gas taxes to fix the roads.
Let's shut down Chicago or the transit system in Chicago and see what happens with the highway system. They're complementary to each other. One doesn't work without the other. And, transit sees highway users as their market. Highway users who have no choice see transit as a way to get other vehicles off the road. And so I think that's a good argument. Right? And a lot of people buy that, particularly in urban areas. For those on the internet, Bill Volk just said, if without transit, the whole system, financial system in the U.S. would crash. That's right. In New York. Right. Yeah.
The underground in London shuts down, you kill London.
Right. And, if you look at downtown Chicago, I don't know if you've heard of the concept transit-oriented development. That means transit or development that builds up around transit nodes. Well, you can't find a much better one than downtown Chicago. That is there because of the transit system as much as it is because of the highway system. In fact, but for the transit system, we would have strangled the economy of the downtown. We're at capacity and have been at capacity on the highway system for a long time. And it's the transit system provides the additional access. Yes?
Have any solutions that will get us out of this?
Well, I really like the concept of referendum. I don't know if we could ever do a national referendum, but where states allow referendums to create spending, like the LA example, a few years ago they had a referendum for a 0.5% sales tax increase, and they sold it as a way to support investments throughout the city or throughout the LA County, but to expand transit and to get true benefit from that tax dollar. In the past, it needed 60% of the vote. It got 61% of the vote. Where referendums have worked well, and the majority do, it's where the sponsors of the referendum do a really good job of explaining to the public what their benefits are going to be. Fast Tracks program is another, in Denver, is a good concept of that. I mean, they created this program first of elements, both highway and transit, sold it to Denver, and it's created the revenue streams that they needed to get it done. And when I was, who was I talking to? I was talking to a congressman earlier this week when I was in Washington, and he said, we do a bad job of explaining the need, the national need to our constituents. We need to do a better job, and I agree with that. Definitely do. But if they can't do it, then it's incumbent upon all the transportation agencies and its stakeholders to come together and explain it themselves. Now, interestingly enough, there's I'm on the board of the Center for Neighborhood Technology, and the center, along with the Active Transportation Alliance, are leading a new transit future campaign that's going to be kicked off on April 3rd. It's going to be backed by Mayor Emanuel and President Preckwinkle, and the objective is to have Cook County increase a tax to support transit. And they're going to have to convince the commissioners on the board of governance for Cook County to support this, and so they're aimed at selling it. And it's modeling itself after LA, but we don't have a referendum. We have a board of commissioners that have that control. So it's going to be interesting to see if we sell it well enough to actually put together enough votes to create a stream of revenue to fund transit expansion. That's up to county government. County controls a number of taxes, most importantly the sales tax and the property tax. So it'll be up to them to determine that if they want more transit.